Humans lie all of the time. In fact, you've probably lied a few times today because lying is one of the most important strategies that any of us use to get an advantage over somebody else. And so human communication often degrades into a kind of arms race. People will try to deceive you and then you will develop the tools to call out their deception. People will try to sell you something and so then you will learn how to smell a rat. This has led some philosophers and psychologists to coin an idea known as epistemic vigilance. Epistemic vigilance is the argument that we all possess an arsenal of tools that allow us to identify and to call out lies. In a seminal paper on the topic, Serber et al. Argued that humans have a suite of cognitive mechanisms for epistemic vigilance, targeted at the risk of being misinformed by others. In other words, we have a built-in lie detector. But according to a recent paper on the topic, it might be time to call BS on our BS detectors. There are two strands to the argument for epistemic vigilance. The first is that adults are constantly recalibrating how trustworthy or how reliable we see other people. We tend to be a truth by default species, which means that we assume that most people at least start out being truthful in their interactions with us. In the 1970s, the philosopher Paul Grice argued that when we go into any conversation with somebody else, we often assume that everybody is obeying the same four principles. We assume that they will keep the conversation relevant, that they won't say too much, they won't say too little, and so on. But one of the biggest factors is that we assume that other people are telling the truth most of the time and in normal circumstances. But of course, over time, if somebody tells a lie or they get something wrong again and again, we will recalibrate our epistemic vigilance. We say, okay, well, Alex clearly knows nothing about football, so let's stop asking him about that. Or, Nina is a total and pathological liar, let's not trust her. The second observation is that children learn very early on whom to trust and whom not to trust. The psychologist Pascal Boyer observed that infants seem to be sensitive to the difference between an expert and a novice agent. Later, toddlers will use cues of competence to judge different individuals' utterances and mistrust those who have been wrong in previous instances, or those who seem determined to exploit others. The argument therefore goes that humans are born with a certain skill set or a certain vigilance for seeking truth over falsity. We have epistemic vigilance. But the philosopher Joseph Scheiber thinks that there is something wrong with this analysis. He doesn't dispute the fact that we are vigilant, the evidence seems to suggest that we are, but he does dispute whether that vigilance is epistemic. The problem is that humans have been shown again and again to be especially bad at telling truth from falsehood. As Scheiber puts it, despite many decades of research, the findings are remarkably consistent in demonstrating that humans are quite poor at deception detection. If we have a built-in lie detector, it is hugely inaccurate, it's often turned off, and it's easily distracted by other things. In 1991, Paul Ekman and Maureen O'Sullivan did a review, and in that review they showed that most people can only spot a lie about 60% of the time. And that means for most people you might as well be tossing a coin. And over 3 decades since, the research barely has moved that number. And what's more, Scheiber even argues that this number doesn't change between job to job, or profession to profession, or even person to person. People like customs inspectors, federal law enforcement, and police officers, people whose entire working lives depend on their ability to detect a lie, are no better than the rest of us. We also aren't very good at telling who is competent or not. There are 2 studies from 1996 and 2005 that show how people often use non-epistemic factors to determine when somebody is good at their job. For example, we might wrongly think that somebody with the right face is competent, or that somebody who walks or who talks or who holds themselves a certain way can reveal their ability. But in reality, none of these can reliably account for a person's trustworthiness or their competence. And so we are left with 2 facts. We are vigilant about what people are saying, but that vigilance is not based on epistemic grounds. And so the question then becomes, what kind of vigilance do we have? For that, Scheiber coined the expression the Nietzsche Thesis. Scheiber argues that our goal in conversation is not primarily to achieve truthfulness, but actually self-preservation. In other words, we accept or reject statements based on utilitarian grounds, not on their truthfulness. In Nietzsche's words, we will accept or look for truth only when it has pleasant or life-preserving consequences. Conversely, we are hostile to potentially harmful and destructive truths. We do not have an epistemic vigilance, but a Machiavellian vigilance. There is one important observation about modern society that might lend credence to Scheiber's ideas, and that is the popularity and prevalence of echo chamber nonsense. If epistemic vigilance were true, then we would be fact-checking and dismissing nonsense all of the time, but that's simply not the case. When a charismatic or a compelling speaker delivers a statement, we will accept it much more often based on these Machiavellian lines. I will nod along if others nod along. I will accept it if it preserves my social status. Scheiber's thesis raises huge questions not only for philosophy but also for law. Because if people aren't wired for the truth, then how reliable is their testimony? It's also an important point to remember in our interactions with other people, as well as in what we hear or read or see online. It's good to remember that we are very bad at and little concerned with the truth. We are often concerned with other non-epistemic things.